Welcome to Power Up Memphis. I'm your host, Gale Jones Carson. I'm the Vice President of Community and External Affairs. The aim of Power Up Memphis is to take you, our customers, on an inside tour of MLGW to share our programs and operations with you. And by doing so, we can all better understand how we function as your utility provider. Today's guest is Doug McGowen, who is our new President and CEO. Today I have a special guest on, and he is the new President and CEO of Memphis Light Gas and Water, and that's Doug McGowen. Doug, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Gail. Appreciate it.
Okay, so Doug, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, first, let me say how grateful I am that Mayor Strickland appointed me to this position, that City Council ultimately approved me. It is a privilege and an honor to serve the community in the role leading MLGW and all the 2,500 employees that we have. We came, my family and I, to Memphis in 2005. We fell in love with the community, and when I retired about 6 years later from the Navy, we decided to make Memphis our home. And then I set about finding work that would allow me to continue to work in the community, continue to serve, give back. I had the opportunity to work with Mayor Wharton during his administration, and now Mayor Strickland for the last 7 years in his administration, helping to make our community better. I think we have moved our community forward significantly in that time. I'm very pleased to have worked with so many people who are integral in helping our community have the momentum that it does have.
So you worked with Mayor Strickland for about 7 years. What would you say was your greatest accomplishment? Well,
I think, certainly the momentum that the community has is a credit to a lot of folks. Internally to the city is my accomplishments there are really the accomplishments of the people I had to work with. And that is, there were so many people in the city that were given an opportunity to step up and do something they had never done before. And then to watch them grow into that role and to do it very successfully. That's the thing I look back on with the greatest deal of pride, is the people I worked with that had an opportunity to do something, and they have stayed in the city. Some have moved on, but all of them have elevated their game and really had some individual success. So that's something I'm very proud of. I'm proud of our city for our resilience, and looking back on some of the things that we have gone through as a city, and we've come out the other end stronger. I'm incredibly proud to call Memphis our home, and I brag all the time to people in other cities about how great of a city Memphis is.
So moving forward to December 12th, your first day physically on the job at Memphis Light Gas and Water. And just a few days later, we have a Arctic storm across the country that you had to deal with. We had the boil advisory boil water advisory that you had to deal with. And with those kinds of weather events, you have a lot of people who are just very frustrated about the incident, no matter whether it's God-related or natural disasters or whatever. So, Doug, tell us give us the beginning and the end of how you dealt with this major storm that we just went through, that this whole country experienced.
Sure. Well, I think first, as you mentioned, I was in the seat for a very short period of time, but it really doesn't matter whether you're in charge for 1 day or 10 years when an incident happens. Somebody has to be accountable for making sure that things get done, and that was me at the time, and I was thankful to have a wonderful team to work with to help get those things done. So what really did start on December 23rd was a quite unexpected loss of generation capability. That is, the ability to produce electricity by the Tennessee Valley Authority. They had several pieces of their equipment, a coal-fired plant and a gas-fired plant, that suffered pretty heavily from the cold temperatures, essentially froze up their ability to operate. That combined with some pretty deeply widespread, very cold temperatures, which caused the electricity demand, in other words, how much energy people wanted to use, was at the highest it's ever been in the Tennessee Valley. So we lost some generation, we had an increasing demand, And when those lines cross, that means something bad is going to happen with the electrical grid. So,
and I do want to mention TVA has 153
they do.
customers, 152 other customers, just like Memphis, I guess, Water.
So we have a contract to purchase our power from the Tennessee Valley Authority, as you said, as do 152 other local power companies. Mm-hmm. And so when I mention the demand, I'm speaking across the Tennessee Valley, not just the MLGW. Exactly. Our demand was what we believe to be within our normal range during that period of time. But we are reliant on Tennessee Valley Authority to produce energy for us, and when the Tennessee Valley grid is at risk, we all have to share in the obligation to keep something much worse from happening. You'll recall several years ago in Texas, they had a very deep electrical crisis, and that caused them to be without power for several weeks. That's the condition we were trying to avoid. And the solution was what they call to shave the peak of the demand off so that we had enough generation to meet the demand. And the way that TVA chose to do that was to tell all of the local power companies, you need to reduce your consumption by 5%. And then on the second day, they told us we had to reduce our consumption by 10%. The way that that is done in the industry typically is by what they call rolling blackouts. To explain what that is that across the Memphis Light gas and water system, we have several hundred circuits that serve different parts of the city. So we take approximately 5% of those circuits and turn the power off to those circuits, which means the people that are on those circuits lose power for what we plan to be 30 minutes. And then we select the next group of circuits that would constitute 5%, turn them off, and we turn back on the circuits for the people that we had just turned off. And then you keep doing that through groups of circuits throughout the city and the service area. That was the first time we have ever had to do that in the 90-year history of TVA and Memphis Light Gas and Water. That was something that we at Memphis Light Gas and Water have no local control over. We must comply because of federal regulations in our contract with TVA. We must comply. And it's important to understand why we must comply. Harkening back to what happened in Texas, we never want to be in that position such that our whole system is at risk. So it is very inconvenient for people when that happens. It's especially frustrating when you have no notice and no warning. For a lot of reasons, we also did not have any warning. On the morning of the 23rd, the night before, the temperature dipped pretty low, and we already had some customers who were without power. So we were meeting locally with our MLGW team to figure out how we were going to restore power to customers who had lost it. That was about 9 in the morning. Shortly after we started meeting, TVA said, hey, we may have to start voluntarily curtailing some power. We talked about that briefly, and before we could even talk about how we might do that, they issued the mandatory Step 50, it's a technical term for rolling blackouts, saying you must now cut power.
And we've never had rolling
We've never had to do that, and when I say that's the kind of warning, that's what I mean is while we were talking about how we might voluntarily curtail power, they immediately told us we had to do it in a mandatory fashion. So we did that for about 2 hours on the 23rd. We were told on the morning of the 24th, the afternoon of the 23rd, that we might have to do it again the morning of the 24th. And so we tried to convey to our customers what the plan would be. And on the morning of the 24th, about 2 hours prior to when we expected it, we were ordered again to enter in rolling blackouts, and that lasted for about 5 or 6 hours. So we understand how frustrating it can be for folks. We understand that some people were out of power for 30 minutes, others for 45. Some people were for several hours.
So why was there a difference between, we said rolling 30,
right,
and then some were out longer. And so some of our customers don't understand what happened.
That's a really good point. So there's really 3 reasons why people experience either multiple outages or longer than what we advertised. The first is people who were impacted by the weather. A tree had fallen because of the wind. Their power may have been out for several days while we cleared the tree and repaired the lines, obviously. During the rolling blackout, when we ordered that, As I said, remotely we activate the switches that turn power off and back on. When we did that, it reliably turned the power off. When we ordered it to turn back on, about 70 to 80% of the time they did come back on, but the other 20 to 30%, the switches did not. We are still working out why that happened, but many of our switches are pneumatic. That means they're driven by air. And if there's moisture in a pneumatic switch, it will freeze, preventing it from activating. So we're going to take a look at that and see if there's something we can do with an investment to maybe fix that to prevent that from happening. But people, when that happens, we can't automatically restore it. Our technicians have to go into the substation and actually manually throw that switch back. So certainly people who were on that circuit were going to be without power for more than 30 minutes while we found the switch that wasn't working and then manually reset that. And we have 60 plus substations around. So depending on which circuit at which substation, we had to drive around to those stations. So, and the third reason that people may have experienced a longer than they anticipated outage was on Saturday morning, Christmas Eve, we started with a 5% load reduction. TVA about 20 minutes later ordered a 10% load reduction. Well, that plan is a different set of circuits. And so when we shifted to that plan, sometimes people who had just had an outage were included in the new plan. That was not our intent. Our intent is to roll from one neighborhood to the next, to the next, to the next. When they shifted plans midstream, we had to start with the new plan, the 10% plan, and sometimes that included neighborhoods that had already been out. That's something we will look at to see if there's a way we can improve that as we go forward. But that explains why some people had shorter and longer periods of time without power.
So you mentioned going from this area to this area to this area. So how were those areas selected? How did you make those decisions?
Well, our system operators understand the design of the power system, and they have to create a plan that can allow us to shed 2.5%, 5, 10, and then that has to be approved all the way up the line through the Energy Regulatory Commission. Okay. And so once we have that plan approved, that's what we have to execute. We picked those circuits. The only ones that are excluded are circuits upon which hospitals operate and other essential functions like the wastewater treatment plant, because you don't want to have a separate, another crisis induced by rolling blackouts. So every neighborhood in our service area is included in those circuits that we would pre-select for a rolling blackout. So there are no exceptions.
So nothing had nothing to do with which area of town you lived in.
It doesn't matter if you lived in Arlington, Bartlett, Boxtown, Nutbush, Orange Mound, South Memphis. Every neighborhood is included. There are some selected parts of those neighborhoods that may not experience an outage because they may share the same circuit with a hospital. That's just sheer luck in the way the system is designed. But yes, every neighborhood is subject. We had just over 50% of our neighborhoods impacted, and if we had continued, everybody would have had their power off at one time or another. So it is literally system design. It's not picking on any one neighborhood over the other.
So you didn't wake up New Year's Eve day and say, we're going to have roller blackouts today.
No, we did not. We did not know that. In fact, in our preparation, we knew we were going to have very cold temperatures. We were very worried about the water system because of what had happened about 2 years prior. With the electrical system, it actually, with the deep freeze, we said that there wouldn't be widespread power outages. Now, that doesn't mean that they wouldn't happen all over, but that meant there wasn't going to be a ton of customers without power. And that's what we saw was a couple thousand out of 440,000 customers lost power. So that's not a huge impact, and it's not unusual for us in a mild storm like that. So that's the impacts of the storm on the electrical system. What we did not anticipate, nor did Tennessee Valley, nor did any of the people at Duke Energy that serves North Carolina and the Carolinas, nor did some of the other energy companies. Nobody anticipated this huge demand and this loss of generation capacity. So we certainly were not prepared for that, and the first time this has ever happened in 90 years.
So what was the time frame that we pretty much got everybody back on?
Well, that is a good news story, I think, for us. As I said, throughout the course of the storm and the rolling blackouts, 260,000 customers lost power for some period of time or multiple periods of time. By midnight on Christmas Eve, we had all customers turn back on. There were 30 customers who had individual outages. Those might have been businesses or homes, but they were individual outages at their home, not as a part of the whole street. That is something that I know is frustrating to people, that it took us that while to get it back on, but I do want to say that there are other very large cities in the South who did not enjoy that success. They still had thousands of customers without power going into Christmas Day. And that was something we were eager to do, was our team, and I want to compliment the men and women of Memphis Light Gas and Water. You'll recall how bitter cold it was. It was single-digit temperatures with wind chills well below zero. And our linemen, troubleshooters, utility persons were out there working in those temperatures, doing everything they could to get power restored to all of our communities, to their friends and their neighbors. And we know that it disrupted the holiday for many people. It's not something we would have ever wished to do, but I do want to say our team at Memphis Light Gas and Water sacrificed all of their holiday in order to get people back on. And that's something, so if you see a lineman or a crew in your neighborhood, please reach out and thank them for what they did, which I think they did a pretty darn good job of getting us back on.
So Doug, we moved from that crisis to the boil water advisory crisis.
Sure. Well, that was interesting. You'll remember in February of 21, we had weather that was single digits for about 9 days. In that event, we had about 140 water main breaks, and we had a boil water advisory that lasted 8 days. The event that we just went through, we had sub-freezing temperatures for about 3 days. We suffered.
That was a difference. The degree temperature days was what the difference was.
That was a real difference there, and people remember that we had a boil water advisory, but not for how long. What happened in this case was, with that rapid drop in temperatures and the wind chills being so low, we did suffer some water main breaks. We had about 50 water main breaks. 2 years ago, we had about 140. This time, though, we saw many more customers with water line breaks in their homes and in their businesses. And importantly, we also saw a lot of fire protection systems in our commercial customers that had breaks in their fire protection systems. So when you take all those together, a break of the water line in the street, which is sometimes very large diameter, a break in a fire protection system, which are also very large diameter pipes, it's difficult to get water downstream to customers. And so what we experienced was low pressure situations in much of the service area. And then in some selected areas, they had no water because there was so many leaks upstream from them that we just couldn't pump the water to them. So a couple of things. First, this could have been much worse. But since 2020, we've invested $50 million in our water system. That was mostly aimed at our wells, and our system works like this. There are wells that pump water out of the ground. There are hundreds of those. Those wells pump water into our water treatment plants. There are 9 of those. Our water treatment plants, they treat the water, and then they have pumps that push the water out into the water mains that go to everybody's neighborhoods. So essentially, in 2021, we had some wells freeze up. We had some pumping stations that didn't work, and so we couldn't push water out as effectively as we did this time. Because of the investments we've made this time, we were able to push water into the system, keep as many people's pressure at normal or at least acceptable as possible, and then we avoided having a lot of people without water. That doesn't mean that some people weren't, but without those investments, this would have been much worse. By December 29th, so this started around December 24th. By December 29th, and on December 24th, we had to declare the boil water advisory. Let me talk about that for just a minute. There was nothing ever detected in our water. We tested every day, and there was nothing ever detected. However, by regulation, if our water pressure drops below 20 pounds per square inch, we must issue a precautionary boil water advisory, because there are points in the system where the pressure will obviously be lower than 20, and you could have some backflow that gets into the system with bacteria or some other things. But we never detected any of that. And so what we had to do first was repair all the water main breaks, and we did that every day. As many breaks as we identified, we fixed. As the temperatures warmed up, we would have new main breaks, and we would fix those.
Well, what causes that? Because the temperature it gets warmer. What causes the pipes to break?
It's essentially thawing, the freezing and thawing. So there's two things. There's the ground that the pipes sit in has moisture. And when that moisture gets cold, it freezes. And water, when it freezes, expands. And so if you can imagine, a pipe is in the ground and the earth around it is freezing. That means the water in it is freezing and expanding, which means it's putting pressure on that water pipe and sometimes fracturing the water pipe because it's got so much pressure. That's mechanically what's happening. In people's homes, what's happening and in those fire protection systems is those are not in the ground, but they are exposed to the very cold air. And that very cold air is actually, in a fire protection system, the water's not moving. Well, the water that doesn't move is going to freeze, like ice cubes in your refrigerator. So it's going to freeze, expand, and break that pipe. And when it breaks the pipe, freeze the frozen clog, and the water starts flowing. Same thing in your home. That's why we say to drip the water, because moving water does not freeze. You can see that in nature. You see many creeks and streams in very cold temperature, but they are not freezing because the water's moving. So that's why those two things happen. By December 29th, we were able to get all of the mains corrected, all of the fire protection systems cut off, and get the system pressure back to normal. And as soon as the pressure was back to normal, we tested all of the samples from across the entire community. I think it was more than 80 samples we took just to make sure the water was safe. Took it to the lab, did an 18-hour analysis, which is our requirement. Put it in an incubator to make sure that there was nothing bad growing in the water. And once that came out and was good, the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation was good partners to us. And they have to give us the approval to lift the boil water advisory. So as soon as we possibly could, we got that boil water advisory lifted. So we'll always look for ways that we can improve. One of the things we're going to do as a result of this is work with the business owners locally to find out, how can we help with these fire protection systems. I do want to mention that many of these were in businesses that were normally occupied, but because it was a holiday weekend, there was nobody there. And so nobody could see that that was happening. And also, we don't have a meter on those fire protection systems because you're normally not using the water. And when water does come out, you want there to be a lot of water. So we want to talk with them about how we might be able to do this to prevent damage to their business and also to prevent impacting customers downstream if they do have a break.
So you have mentioned that we will be working closer with TVA on future plans. Say, like for me, one of the concerns I have is normally when we have freezing temperatures like that, it's like in February. So we had this in December. So if we have this in this February, you'll be working with TVA with plans, internally with plans, assessing what we're doing so we can be prepared for February or any other month.
Absolutely. So I think there's really three phases to that. There's the immediate action. So what have we learned from this immediate situation? Because we could have freezing temperatures a week from now. So what can we improve in that short period of time, communications-wise, preparation-wise? Is there anything we could do very quickly to make it better if this happened, if the cold temperatures happen again? And then I think there's a little bit shorter term, from immediate to short-term planning. What can we do for the rest of the winter to make sure that we are as prepared as we possibly can and communicate to people? And then there's longer term planning, and that goes for all of our systems. So what kinds of investments will TVA make in additional generation? What kind of analysis do we need to do on the energy demand? It was the highest demand we've ever seen. So what was going on there? Folks have talked about, well, maybe it was all the electric cars being charged. We just don't know yet, but we have to look into why it went so high. And then for us, those longer term plans are what do we need to invest in? I mentioned the 50 million in the water system. Well, we have another 230 million to go to make sure our water system continues to operate under every condition. We have $800 million we're putting into our electrical system so that when we have a storm like we just had, rolling blackouts aside, customers should expect their power to stay on, unless it's a really bad storm. And that's our goal, is to make investments such that their power stays on, unless it is a really extreme event. And I know, I hear it from people all the time, well, when the wind blows, my power goes out. So that's the investments we have to make. Some of those are in, I'll mention it now, the tree trimming as a reliability measure. We have a wonderful tree canopy here in Memphis, but we also have a lot of overhead power lines, and people can go out in the street and see it. There are power lines right through the trees, and those two things just can't coexist. And that's why you hear people say, well, the wind blows and my power goes out. That's because a branch has touched a power line, and it has opened the circuit now and caused a fault. And then we have to go back out there, find it, and close it and fix it. So as much as nobody likes to have their tree butchered, as they say in some cases, it's necessary because I think more important than that is having consistent power. And certainly we'll look at doing other measures besides just tree trimming to make sure we can increase reliability.
Okay, Doug, so you have given us a lot of valuable information. First, people get to know who Doug McGowen is, and you just talked to us about the storms that we went through and the challenges that we face. What would you say as we close to our viewing audience? What do you have to share with them?
Well, I think a couple of things. First, although we've had this incident very recently, we do have the benefit of a very reliable utility system. I've lived all over the world and all over the country, and rolling blackouts are a way of life in some parts of this country. I lived out west, I won't mention the states, where we just knew every day we were on a schedule to be blacked out. And for the whole time we lived there, that's how we lived, was with rolling blackouts. I've also lived in places where you've had to conserve water on certain days. You couldn't use water on certain days for certain things. You could always drink it, but you didn't have options to use water. And I've lived in places where there was no natural gas available and you had to use electric power for your heat. And in those places, the electricity was very expensive too. So we have the benefit of a wonderful and abundant gas supply that our team has done a really good job of keeping the prices down on. We have a really good electrical system. We're talking about the reliability. We do need to improve that, but we have not had to suffer rolling blackouts as a course of day-to-day life. And clearly, our water system we have the best water in the world right here. Our forefathers invested in a really good system. That means two things. Number one, we've had the benefit of 100 years of really good water system. The other side of that is much of the system is 100 years old, so we have to invest in it to keep it reliable. And so I know that doesn't feel that way when your power goes out or when you're on boil water advisory, but on a day-to-day basis, compared to other big cities, we really do have a wonderful opportunity. It's my job to make sure that we make it all more reliable. I really don't want people to have to think about us, just go on about their lives, living a prosperous life here in Memphis, Tennessee.
Well, Doug, thank you for being with us today, and thank you for being with us at Memphis Light Gas and Water. We look forward to your leadership and keeping us every step above where we need to be.
Thank you, Gale. Appreciate it.
You're watching the Library Channel, a broadcast service of the Memphis Public Libraries and the City of Memphis.